Hi, everyone, and welcome to SoundStory. I'm Randy Karraker, and it is great to have you with us as we review the life and times of Larry Bowyer. And Larry, it is great to meet you. Thanks so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to learning about your life and times.
Yeah, me too.
So it'll be great. So tell us about the young years of Larry Bowyer. Where were you born, and where did you grow up?
I was born and raised in St. Petersburg, Florida,
Mhm.
fourth generation Floridian. Uh, my ancestors moved to St. Pete in 1900 and were citrus growers. So we grew up on the citrus grove. My grandmother and grandfather lived in the grove, and when they had kids, they gave each one of their six kids an acre plot on the farm. And so I grew up with my grandmother and my aunts and uncles and cousins, and I could walk to my grandmother's house. And so it was great. We loved it.
When you were growing up around the groves, did you spend time picking citrus?
We used them as kids as weapons. We'd go
Really?
out there and we'd have orange fights, but we also picked them and ate them, tangerines and oranges, and the grapefruit we left for the weapons.
Good idea. That's the way I feel about grapefruit too, Larry. So
Yeah.
there obviously then there was a lot of land out there for you and your friends to play. What did your friends, besides having grapefruit fights, what did you and your friends do?
Uh, well, we were just outside all the time, building forts. Across the street from us was woods, and there was huge palmetto plants, and we would go inside the palmetto plants, and that would be our fort. So we would build a fort inside the palmettos until we realized one day that that's where the snakes also like to live.
How did the snakes make themselves? How did that manifest itself that you found that out?
Well, actually, it was my dad that told us, but we found a diamondback rattler that was about the size I was, probably 4 or 5 feet tall at the time, and the snake was as tall as I am.
Okay.
And my dad shot it with a shotgun, and he warned us about playing in the palmettos because he told us that's where they live. So we
Have
didn't
you,
do that too much anymore.
and obviously there are a lot of snakes and a lot of wildlife in Florida. Have you ever seen since then a snake that long?
Uh, well, one of the interesting stories, to go to school, it's about 6 blocks away, and we were back then you could ride your bicycle to school, uh, but sometimes I'd walk and I'd cut through the woods, could made it a shorter walk to school, and I guess I was in the Cub Scouts or Boy Scouts at the time, and they taught us how to catch snakes, and so I was probably still in elementary school. They had show and tell one day, and on the way to school, I caught a black snake that was probably 3 feet long, like that long. And I took it to show and tell. And going back and forth to school, I would see that same snake occasionally. And another day of show and tell, I took it back to school, and the teacher said, "Okay, no more snakes at show and tell." But I learned how to catch it without getting hurt, and so. But I've never seen a diamondback rattler that big since then.
Uh-huh. So, Larry, you were born in 1944, so you were growing up right at the beginning of the baby boom. So, as you grew up, were there a lot of kids to play with? Was it pretty? Was school full? Was Cub Scouts full? The events that you were involved with?
Well, the neighborhood wasn't because it was a family farm for the most part, but there were a few kids, maybe 4 or 5 kids that lived within walking distance. So we played, and back then everything you did was outside.
Mhm.
We didn't have games that you played around all day indoor. And we lived in Florida, so the weather was great most of the time. So we were outside. In school, of course, you meet friends there, and that's where the Cub Scout troop was. So yeah, there were a lot of people that we met through that.
And then you wound up going to Northeast High School in St. Petersburg. What was that
Right.
like for you?
Well, an interesting part of the story was my grandmother's father owned the land where he had his orange groves, and it's now where the Northeast High School is. And he donated some of the land around Northeast High School. So, I mean, it was kind of special to be going to school where my grandfather, great grandfather, had something to do with it. But yeah, we started in high school. My outside social life started, I guess, when I was in junior high school, now called middle school. But seventh, eighth, and ninth grade was at Lellman Junior High School. And that was close enough that we rode our bikes back and forth to school. And we'd stop at the way home in a little corner store and hang out with our buddies and buy Cokes and candy bars and tell stories. And so, yeah. And then Northeast was, I was young for my age. I was born in December. So I started sophomore year when I was 14. And so I didn't get a driver's license till I was halfway through my junior year. So
Larry, as you talk to right now, you're talking to your kids and your grandkids and your great grandkids who will see and hear this. You mentioned that your social life started when you were in middle school. What was that like? Are you a social person, first of all? And you mentioned you went down and you hung out at the store. What was that like in middle school?
well, it was fun. It's kind of like I guess my parents raised me to be independent, and I am.
Mhm.
And so it was nice to have the freedom to be able to ride my bike to school and come home, within a reasonable time after school, and not have them tracking every moment that I was gone. And I guess we had dances in our middle school, and I had my first girlfriend when I was, I think, in seventh grade. I can't remember for sure, but I still stay in touch with her today after all these years at high school reunions. We're still good friends, and we had the dances, and I was trying to remember the other day why I broke up with her, but I can't remember. But it must have been friendly because we've stayed in touch all these years. So
What
yeah,
about other friends? Have you stayed in touch with other friends, middle and high school?
uh, not really. I have a couple that we stay in touch. Maybe every other year or so, we'll meet up somehow, but not a lot.
Mhm.
I guess in junior high school, or actually in elementary school, I got involved in the band. They had a program where you could learn how to play an instrument. So I learned how to play the trumpet. It's a cornet, but it's very similar to a trumpet. So I learned how to play that. I think it was third grade, and I enjoyed that a lot. And then in junior high school, I got in the junior high school band, and we went to parades and things like that. But then partway through junior high, the band director came and to a friend of mine and I and said, "We need somebody to play the sousaphone," which is the big one that goes all around your
Sure.
neck,
Yeah.
and it's very much like playing a trumpet, except it's big.
Mhm.
The notes are all the same, and so it was easy to convert. So a friend of mine and I decided to play the sousaphone, and we had a great time doing that because played it on into high school, And in high school, when you're in parades and things like that, you probably see it at football games where the guys with these big instruments, they'll turn them down and bring them
Uh-huh.
up, and it's just a lot of fun. So that was my primary social activity. I thought that was where I made most of my friends in junior high school and high school.
Did you maintain your musical prowess? Did you keep playing at all after you were finished with high school or college?
But no, I didn't keep playing the trumpet, but I always kept playing something. I I was
So music,
self-taught.
yeah, music is a part of your life.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed music, and this is one of them. I keep that self-taught how to play harmonica.
Can you give us a little ditty right now? We'd love to hear it.
Here, let's see.
Little Amazing Grace. Thank you.
Yeah,
Great.
that's always
Uh,
been one of my favorite songs.
uh,
I have a boat that you'll probably learn about in. We go. I've gone offshore sailing a lot, and I
yeah.
get people out there in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, and I say, I have a captive audience now. You're going to have to listen. And
Yeah.
so I have a repertoire of probably 20 or 25 songs that I play, and I love it, and most people like to hear it. So
That's fantastic. Uh,
yeah,
when did you meet your bride, Anne Marie?
uh, at a party after high school. I'm 2 years older than she is, and we were at a party at a mutual friend's house, and got to talking and got interested, and soon after that, we had our first date at a drive-in movie theater, and we dated for 3 years, and we got all our fighting out of the way in the 3 years, and we've been married for 58.
That's fantastic. And Larry, how quickly into the relationship did you think to yourself, oh, she might be the one, or she is the one? It was pretty
Well,
quick.
I have to, no, I have to back up a little bit, because in high school I had a girl that I really fell hard for,
Mhm.
and she broke up with me after about a year and a half. And so I was very reluctant to get back into a relationship. And so when I got into started dating again, I wasn't ready to commit. So I was fighting getting
Mhm.
into a relationship. So it was probably a year and a half, uh,
Uh,
something like that.
And how did you propose to her?
Well, it's kind of embarrassing to say, but I was been with a couple at the Pinellas County Fair, and we were walking down the fairway at the fair, and I had been drinking a little bit, and Anne Marie and I had started thinking about it, and this couple we were with was married, and I kind of admired them and liked the life that they were living, and I looked over at Anne Marie and I said, we ought to get married, and that was it.
Nothing wrong with it. It was natural.
Yeah, it wasn't romantic. It just felt like the right thing to do.
Uh, Larry, you had a very, very successful career. When you started at the University of Florida, is what you planned on doing when you started college what you took out to do, or was it different? What was your plan heading to the University of Florida?
I, I really didn't know. I went into mechanical engineering because I got the good math and science skills, and I also pretty much mechanically inclined. And my younger brother had started before me because I took 3 years off after high school because I knew I wasn't ready. And my younger brother had gone into mechanical engineering. And so I looked at the curriculum and I thought, yeah, those courses sound interesting. So I just started taking those courses and liked it. And I really, even when I graduated, and I've taught this in high schools afterwards, that told the kids, you know, you learn the knowledge you need to be an engineer, but you don't learn how to be an engineer in college. You learn that afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew I didn't know how to be an engineer. So I interviewed tons of firms. I had probably 10 or 12 job offers graduating from college. And I did that because I wanted to see all the different things that mechanical engineers do. And so I got into engineering that was more of a consulting type engineering. I worked for a central engineering department of Armstrong World Industries. They're the people that make linoleum floors and acoustical ceilings and that sort of thing. And so I went to work for their central engineering department, which consulted to all of their different plants around the country. And so it fit me because it was a people type job. It was not, it was technical, but it was more dealing with people than it was dealing with numbers and ideas. And so I really liked that. I fell into it and excelled and did really well.
I want to come back to this, but I want to go back to the years that you took. When you said I wasn't ready for college after high school. First of all, for an 18 or 17-year-old, that's pretty self-aware. Do you remember why you thought you weren't ready for college at that time?
I think it had to do with my emotions after the breakup of my first girlfriend.
Mm-hmm.
Just my world was kind of in a turmoil, and I wasn't ready to study.
Uh-huh.
I didn't graduate from high school on time because of all of that, and ended up having to go to night school during the summer and graduated in the fall after my graduation, and just wasn't ready.
And then how did college change you? How did those years at Florida change you?
I think it was more marriage that changed me than anything else.
And you got married before you started college, right? Or during college?
I actually started at St. Pete Junior College for the first 2 years, and that was when I guess I started getting serious with Anne Marie,
Mm-hmm.
and figured if I wanted anything to happen with this, I better get rid of my party life and start buckling down a little bit. So uh, went to St. PJC for the first 2 years, and then transferred to the University of Florida, and that's when she said, "I'm going with you."
Okay, great.
So December of that year is when we got married.
Wonderful. And then how quickly after you got married did you have your first child? And by the way, your oldest is Krista, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how long after you got married did you start the family?
Let's see, two and a half years.
Okay. So, and you mentioned that marriage changed you, which it does all of us. But then that's a life changer too, isn't it? When you have the first child.
Yeah, it is. In fact, when she was first born, we lived in a mobile home. My dad had the foresight to. He was a CPA, and he was an auditor for the company that sold mobile homes.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Larry, got to buy a mobile home when you go to college. We'll get you a used one, reasonable. And then that way, when you graduate from college, you have some money in your pocket. You can sell it. So we lived in a mobile home, an older one. And I tell you that because I tell you about my daughter. I think within the first week after she was born, we wanted to go get an ice cream cone. So we hopped in the car and started down the street. And we realized that Krista's still at home in her crib. We forgot her. So that's how it changes your life. You have to.
God, no doubt. Yeah, that poor defenseless child alone in her crib at home, right?
Right. So that didn't happen again. But we actually planned it so that she would be born after we graduated. Anne Marie's doctor told her, her gynecologist said, "You've been on the pill for a couple of years. It's after you quit taking it, it's probably going to take you a while to be able to get pregnant." So that night when we got home, just on a whim, I was in the bathroom punching her pills out in the toilet. And so she didn't take any more pills, but she got pregnant within a week.
Wow.
So Krista was born 6 months before we graduated instead of 6 months after.
Wow. Okay. So you're starting the family. You mentioned you're with Armstrong World Industries. Uh, how was that job? Was it time consuming? Did you have to travel? Tell us about your initial experience with Armstrong World Industries.
Well, I had a unique experience compared to most of my compatriots at the time, because what they would do is they would take the new engineers and they put them in the drafting room for 6 months and teach them how to design things, what things look like. And they were going to put me there, but they were starting up a new plant about 30 miles away in Marietta, Pennsylvania. And they needed some help on the startup. So they tagged me up with a senior engineer out in the field. And I worked on the startup for about a year. And it was the best thing that could have happened to me, because I wasn't happy sitting at a drafting board,
Mm-hmm.
even though it was only 6 months. But so I was out in the field. I was dealing with problems every day. I was working with a senior engineer that knew how to fix problems. And, I learned more in that time than I learned in college.
And
So,
during this time in Pennsylvania, did you have Anne Marie and Krista with you?
yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. They moved with me. So that was it. And then once we got the plant started back, I moved back into the central engineering department, which was like the consulting arm of the of Armstrong. And it was assigned to projects in Pensacola and Marietta and Macon, Georgia, one in Greenville. So I traveled not a lot, but enough to go down and scope out projects and talk to the people that had a need, and then come back to central engineering and get our staff to put together a design that would fix the problem.
Larry, did it ever turn out that you had to be at a drafting board?
No.
And so you got pretty, it sounds like you got pretty fortunate.
I escaped.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's good. And so as you ascend through this job and you're basically charged with helping the company grow, right? What was that like?
It was exciting. Again, because I was working at all these plants, different plants.
Mhm.
I was meeting different people all the time, solving different problems, as opposed to being assigned to one plant. And I really liked that. I lost track of your question, but that was
So just helping you got a chance, rather than be at a drafting board, you got a chance to move around and help the company grow into what it became, right?
right.
So
Right.
and then you really ascended. And I want to get back to the children being born, but I also want you to tell us now about your sense through the company, how they allowed you to go within the company.
Well, I guess one of the things I stood out for some reason. I think one reason was I wasn't afraid to speak up. I was a little older than most of the new recruits because I had taken 3 years off, and I think that actually benefited me because I had a little more maturity.
Mhm.
But in the central engineering department, the vice president of that division, he would hold meetings with all of the new engineers. He would ask us how things are going and, you know, what we liked, what we didn't like. And I was always one that would speak up. You know, we'd be talking amongst ourselves about issues, and we get in that meeting and everybody else would clam up. And I would bring up the issue. I'd say, you know, here's an issue we've been kind of talking about behind the scenes, and, you know, here it is. Why is it this way? And so that I wasn't doing it to get the attention. I was doing it to try to get a problem solved. But I think it brought attention to me that I was willing to confront issues that needed to be confronted. And as a result of that, we were in one of these group meetings, and one of the tasks we had to do was put together our 15-year plan. I think it was a 15-year plan. We knew enough about the company at this point that we could kind of chart our own course. And so I wrote down my plan, and it was to, within 15 years, I wanted to be plant engineer at one of these big plants. And that was a very big job, and it was a very lofty goal. But and people, you know, some of my cohorts at the time said that's impossible. I said, well, that's what I think I want to do. So I wrote that down along. I forget what the interim steps were, but that was my lofty goal. I think they call it a BHAG, a big hairy ass goal, and that was my BHAG. And so I wrote it down, and then we talked about that in the meeting. Well, a couple of years later, well, again, amongst my peers, we would sit around talking about, well, you know, here's a plant engineer at this plant, and he's how old, and this plant and how old, and so on. And so we said there's not going to be any of those openings for a while. And this was after 2 years, 3 years with the company. Well, things were going well, so we decided to buy a new house. And I went to my boss, and I talked to him about it. I said, I need the afternoon off because we're going to go sign the papers to buy this new house. And he said, don't do it. And I said, why? He said, no, I can't say anymore. He said, just go do what you need to do. So we went and bought this new house. And the next day I was called in, and this was 4 years with the company. And I was asked to move to Pensacola to be plant engineer after 4 years.
Wow.
And I thought if I had achieved that by 15, I would have been doing well.
That's incredible.
So, yeah, it was. And the thing that made me feel really good about it was one of my good friends, you know, amongst our group of new recruits. He came to me and he said, finally, somebody got promoted that really deserved it. It wasn't a butt kisser. He said somebody got promoted that really deserved it. And I mean, that made me feel great. So
did you have to sell the house then right away?
the company took care of that for me.
That's great.
Yeah, that was back in the days where companies bought your house and everything to get people to move.
So Larry, I want to go back to you writing that down, and obviously they asked you to do it. But is that something that you do hear so often about successful people writing down their goals, and overwhelmingly more often they achieve those goals if they write them down than the people that don't? So have you done that, and are you an advocate of that?
Yes, I did that during my career when I was in leadership positions.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that was the last time I did it at that company. But yeah, as I've been in leadership positions, I've asked my direct reports to do that.
It's amazing how successful that is. Okay, I want to get back to the family. What kind of a baby was Krista?
Perfect.
Really?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, she slept through the first night.
oh, that's wonderful.
We
Did
didn't, but she did.
did you ever tell her the story about her being alone in the crib at home?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm
Yeah.
glad she knows that.
Yes.
And then 2 years after Krista is born, then Greg is born. You mentioned that you'd planned Krista. Was Greg planned?
Yes. Two and a half years after Krista.
What a great separation. And so tell us about him as a youngster. Boys have a tendency to be a little bit more rambunctious as toddlers than girls do. What was he like?
Well, it wasn't that. He had medical issues. He was born with a hernia in his stomach. And the doctor said he's too young to fix it. But you can't let him cry, because when he cries, it would push his intestine through the wall of the stomach. And they told us that could strangulate it. And so we carried him everywhere. we wouldn't let him cry. You know, it was we just couldn't let him cry. So after 6 weeks, he was still young to fix it, but we couldn't keep him from crying, and his intestine popped through the wall of his stomach. And so they said, we have to go in and fix it. And so they did, and it was successful. And we were happy about that. But then I forget how old he was, still an infant, and he got pneumonia really bad. And kind of back up because it's part of the story, but when we moved to Lancaster, we needed a second car because I was going to work every day, and Anne Marie wanted to finish her schooling. So a neighbor had a car that I bought for $75, an old Nash Rambler. But it was a great car. It ran, it started every time. And so when Greg got this pneumonia, the doctors told us we have to rush him to the hospital. And so in the middle of a snowstorm, I didn't trust my new car, which was a Plymouth. But the Nash Rambler sat kind of high up off the ground, and I figured I can get through the snow with this car. So I took Greg in this old Rambler and my wife, and we went to the hospital, and they took him in and did what they had to do with the pneumonia. But the next day I went into the hospital, and they had my 1-year-old son strapped to the bed like this, his legs strapped down, tubes going in his head, and a pacifier taped across his mouth. And I looked at him, started crying. It still gives me tears to this day. And I looked at my wife and I said, "We're taking him home. We're getting him out of here." And I started taking his tape off his mouth and his legs. And the nurse came in and said, "You can't do that. You can't do that." And I said, "I'm taking him home." Well, they went and got the doctor, and the doctor convinced me that that was a real bad idea. But he assured me that they would make sure that he was taken care of. Well, we stayed. We let Greg stay, but we stayed with him until he got out of the hospital. And he was okay. And that was good. But I wasn't leaving him there.
Yeah. How long did he have to stay?
Pardon me.
How long did he have to stay in the hospital?
I think 2 more days.
That do give me goosebumps just hearing that story. That must have been terrifying.
It was. It was.
So after that, after the surgery for the hernia and having the pneumonia, what was his childhood like? Did he ever get a chance to have a normal
Yeah, I
childhood?
think after that he was a pretty healthy kid, a very active kid. Um, Another story about him. It was probably 3, maybe 4. We couldn't find him because we let our kids play outside. We lived on a street, a cul-de-sac, and they could play outside. We were looking for him. We couldn't find him, and I was looking out front. And he started yelling, "Hey, Dad! Hey, Dad!" He was up in the top of a pine tree that was probably 40 feet tall. He was up there waving, and my wife came out and she said, "Oh, you got to go get him." And I said, "No, he got himself up there. I'm sure he can get himself down." But I stayed out there and watched him to make sure that he got down okay. But he got down by himself. But that's the kind of kid he was. He was willing to try anything. He was a climber. He could climb anything. And so it was good. Krista and Greg got along great. So.
And when he is 7 and Krista is 9 or 10, Jeremy comes along, right?
Right.
So,
we,
and
we,
so I asked you with the first two. The first two were planned. Was this one 7 years later planned too?
yeah, we call him our planned afterthought.
Okay, good.
So we got to the point that the 2 older kids were getting older, and we missed having the babies, and so we decided we'll have 2 more. So Jeremy was the first of our planned 2 more,
Uh-huh.
and he was a good kid also, very very bright. Of course, he was smart because his sister and brother taught him everything.
Uh-huh.
Plus, he had a school teacher mom, so he was a very bright kid.
That's great. That's fantastic. Okay, so you mentioned that the last thing you wrote down at Armstrong was your plan to advance in the company. So what happened after that? How did you move on? What was the next move for you, Larry?
Well, when I was at Armstrong, I guess I stayed about 5 years. 5 years in that role, and I got involved in the kids' soccer programs. I was coaching soccer, and the guy that was coaching with me worked for a consulting firm. And he kept talking to me and he said, "You need to come join us in this consulting business." And I said, "No, I've got a great job. I'm not looking to go anywhere. I like Pensacola, and I want to stay here." And so he kept pushing me. "Yeah, you at least ought to come talk to my boss." And kept saying, "No, no, don't really want to do that." So one time his boss called me and said, "Come on, Larry, let's go have dinner." And so I went and had dinner with him, and he started talking to me about it. So I started listening. And after a few months, I decided, yeah, I think I'll do it. One of the things he said, if you're with Armstrong, you're going to get transferred to Pennsylvania or uh, up in New York. They had a plant. You're going to be somewhere you don't want to be. And he said, if you come with us, you can stay in Pensacola. So I changed companies after, I think it was 9 or 10 years, about 10 years, I guess. So I went to work with HDR, Henningsen, Durham, and Richardson, an international consulting company. So it was it wasn't a local, it was a large consulting company.
And was your job description at all similar to what you were doing at Armstrong, or did you start doing something completely different?
Well, it got back to more what I was doing the first 4 years when I was working at different plants, doing different kinds of projects. So I was doing that kind of thing, but on a much larger scale. So before with Armstrong, I was working on $200,000 or $300,000 projects. Well, at this consulting firm, I was working on $3 to $5 million projects. So it was same thing, but on a bigger scale, a lot more people involved, a lot more technical issues and things like that. So it was a good move.
And you're a highly motivated guy, obviously, to get to the goal that you did at Armstrong after 4 years, and you wound up becoming an executive vice president with HDR. Was that the plan from the start? Did you know, or did they hire you as an EVP? How did that come about?
No, it wasn't my plan. My initial plan was to stay in Pensacola. We fell in love with Pensacola, and so I wanted to stay, and I was enjoying the projects that I was working on. So that this new boss that took me out to dinner to convince me to go to work, a year later, he took me out to dinner again. And the same thing happened. My life changed. He said, we want you to go to Houston, Texas and start up a new office. Because we had done some work in the oil and gas business here in Pensacola. And oil and gas, that's Houston. That's where the oil and gas business is. It's Houston. Mm-hmm. So he wanted to expand the company. And he asked, in fact, when he asked me to go to dinner, he asked my wife to come along. So he had an ulterior motive. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't resist, even though we both loved Pensacola. We decided to go to Houston because of the challenge. It was a challenge to start a new office. And so I did that for 4 years. And it was interesting. The deal was he had a salesman that was working over there. So the sales guy was going to bring in the projects, and then I was going to staff the office and bring in the work. So I got over the first 6 months, and I'm sitting there twiddling my thumbs. There's no work here. I hired a couple of people. We need some work. What are we going to do? And so I went to my boss back in Pensacola, and I said, how about if we take Red's list? Red was the salesman. I said, let's take his list and split it up and give me half of it, and he can take half because I need something to do. And so we did that. And so I was there for 4 years. The only work we got in 4 years was work that I brought in. The other guy brought in nothing. And he and I didn't have a very good relationship. Yeah. But so yeah, I brought in three pretty good sized projects. But then 84 hit, and that was the oil and gas crash in Houston. So everything fell apart. And so I started looking for jobs outside of HDR. And I found one. It was a good job in the construction industry, and I would have been in the sales and management of construction projects. And once I had that job in hand, I went to my boss at HDR and said, I'm concerned about my family and our welfare in the future. I don't want to be unemployed. And I showed him the paper and I said, I have a job, but I'd rather stay at HDR. If you can commit to me that you're going to put me somewhere else when we close this office, then I'll stay. But if you can't commit, I'm going to take this job. And he said, well, give me a couple of days. He needed to go up the chain of command and see what kind of commitment he could get. And he came back and he said, we're going to find you. We will commit to have a job for you. We don't know where it's going to be, but you just have to trust me that we're going to find something. So I said, okay, and called the other company back and said, I decline. I decided to stay where I am. So that's what I did. So shortly after that, I don't know if you remember the MX missile program that was developed back during the Eisenhower years. Well, the new company was working on the MX missile program, and it was all over the United States. And so I traveled for a year from Sunday night through Friday evening, going to these different sites, different projects. That I worked not only on that, but on other projects as well. And so for a year, I traveled back and forth. Friday night, I get home and I forced the kids. I said, on Friday night, you can't go out until after we've had dinner, because I've been gone all week. I want to spend some time with you guys. And so each week I'd let a different kid pick where we were going to dinner. And so we'd go to dinner every Friday night. And I think they hated it, but they kind of enjoyed it.
I'll bet they're good memories now. Yeah.
Yeah. They kind of hated it because they wanted to be out with their friends, but I think they realize now that it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So after a year, they came and said, well, part of what I was doing before we knew we were moving the office was I had a project and we didn't have enough staff in Houston. So we were using some staff in Minneapolis to help us with the design. So I traveled up there quite a bit, and they got to know me and I got to know them. Well, the manager position at that office came open, and HDR had an interview process where they would interview for the position. They just wouldn't appoint somebody, you would have to interview for it. And so Bob, my manager, said, you need to interview for this position. And so I agreed to do that, and I went up for the interview. There were two people that interviewed a local guy that was a member of the staff there. It was a pretty well-respected guy, and me. And I went up and interviewed, and I said, if I interview for this and I win the interview, you have to offer it to me. You know, I want to know that you're going to offer me the job if I interview. And they said, yeah, we'll do that. And so I went through the interviews and came out, I won the interview. And then the president of the company called me, and he was the one that told me that you won. But I have two job offers. We have a job in North Carolina, or no, Greenville, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And we would like you to consider that. But if you want the Minneapolis job, that's yours. And he told me about the job in South Carolina, and he knew that all my family's in the Southeast and thought that that would appeal to me. But that job was going to be traveling 5 days a week, developing new business in the heavy industrial arena. HCR hadn't done a lot before we did in Pensacola and Houston. And so they thought I'd be a good fit as a salesperson to go develop that. And the president said, you've got 24 hours to decide. I said, 24 hours, Dick, give me a break. Dick was the president. Mm-hmm. And he said, we got to move on this. We got to make a decision. So I went home and we talked about it. And my decision was based on the fact I probably would have taken the South Carolina job had I not been traveling for the last year. But because of what that was doing to the family, I said, no, I got to have some stability. So I called Dick back the next day, the president. I said, Dick, we're going to Minneapolis. And it was, you're going where? They knew I was going to South Carolina. They just knew that because of my family being there, that I'd go to South Carolina they would give the job to the local guy and everybody be happy. I said, I'm going to Minneapolis. And so I went to Minneapolis.
Larry, are you ever amazed when you think back to Houston and offering to split the sales? Because you really, then you really weren't a sales guy, right? You were a developer. You were a builder. It
Yeah,
seems.
let me tell you the backstory on that. I had a job offer out of college with Train Air Conditioning at their headquarters in Racine, Wisconsin, and it was a sales job. And I was really, really interested in it. It sounded like something I could do. But one of my good friends in college, I came home and I was talking to him about different offers, and he was a real outgoing guy and typical sales type. And he talked to me. He said, "Larry, you're not a salesman." And since I was kind of on the fence with that, it convinced me that I didn't need to take that job. So anyway, that's the backstory on that. So
you became a prolific somebody that people wanted to hire as a sales guy, right?
yeah. Uh, I realized that the best salespeople are not necessarily the most outgoing, biggest talkers, big joke tellers, all of that. It's about building relationships, and I'm pretty good at that.
That's fantastic. And you got a chance in Minneapolis to kind of, for lack of a better term, reconnect with your family, right?
Yes.
And things
Yeah.
stabilized. What was that like? What were those years like in Minneapolis when you got a chance to get back to your kids?
Well, let me tell you the story about the Minneapolis office, because I think that's a unique story that I don't really know how I developed the skill to be able to do it. But it was a troubled office. And that's why they fired the guy that had been there before. And so they put me in a situation that was a rebuilding situation. And it had been an HDR had an office there. Or no, HDR had acquired a firm there 8 years prior. And they had put some of their own people in. And so 8 years later, that office was a mix between the original Pfeiffer Schultz people and the HDR people. And they didn't get along. In fact, 8 years later, they were still answering the phone, HDR Pfeiffer Schultz. And so when I went in there, I told the president, I said, you got to give me 3 months, because I got to find, I can't go in and start making changes. I've got to learn the culture. I've got to learn the issues, the people, the problems. So give me 3 months, and then I'll tell you what needs to be done. So he gave me 3 months, and I had a great administrative assistant there. Her name was Wanda. I stayed in touch with her until last year when she died. She was 99 years old, but she and I were great friends. But she was a great help to me, and I talked to her about everything about this person, that person. What do you think? This idea, that idea. I'm going to reorganize this way. What do you think? So she was a great person to bounce things off of. And so once I had a pretty set plan in mind, I decided to bring all the key staff together, take them out to dinner, and introduce the plan. And as I was talking to her about that, she said, well, what are you going to do about the rest of the staff? And I said, you're right. I hadn't thought about that. We're going to take all the staff to this meeting, and we're going to tell them what's going on. And so we did it at breakfast. One morning, we closed the office for 2 hours, and we took them all out to breakfast. And the two best things I did, I think, regardless of how I reorganized it, was I said, tomorrow morning when we go in the office, we're going to answer the phone HDR, because that's who this company is. Pfeiffer Schultz is no longer. And I said, the next time you get a paycheck, I want you to look on your paycheck to see who signs it. And it's not Pfeiffer Schultz, it's HDR. And if you don't want to be part of the HDR team, then I invite you to leave, because we're not going to put up with any of this division anymore. It's HDR. And I mean, I did a lot of other things, but those two things alone, I think, were what changed the culture. And there were a couple of people that left that didn't want to be, yeah. But you know, I've learned through my career that no one is indispensable, and so you can always replace somebody. So that within 1 year, I turned that from a place that the company wanted to divest the most profitable office in the company. And it was just we had good projects. We just didn't have people that were willing to work together to design and build the projects the way they needed to be done. And within 1 year, I turned it around. And I don't know how I learned how to do that. It just came from the heart, I guess.
I think people are I think in many cases, leadership is inherent. I think you just have it or you don't. And it sounds to me like you just had that leadership gene, Larry,
Yeah.
you just had that, right? That was a big accomplishment. Was that, what was the height of your career? What was the thing where you say, okay, I really appreciate, and looking back, admire the job that I did in that specific instance? What was the highlight?
There's too many. I guess building off Minneapolis, that was a great learning experience for me, because I knew I had a skill. And by that time, HDR was owned by a French construction company. And so they were looking at the numbers. They were into the numbers. They were more like running it like with accountants instead of with leaders. And they tasked me, along with about 6 or 8 other people, leaders in the firm, to put together a project manager training program across the company. We had, let's see, can't remember now, but about 500 people on the engineering side of the business. And so with 8 or 10 other people, we were tasked with, well, actually they put we put the architectural side, so probably over 1,000 people in the company. Put 10 or 12 of us together to put on this project manager trainer program. And we flew around the country every other weekend for a year, putting on this project manager training program for existing project managers, new project managers. And they put with it the CFO of the French company, a guy, an American, but he worked for the French company, a guy named Bob Pines. Well, Bob and I became very good friends on these 25 weekends around over the year, and kept in touch. And something was going wrong in the company, he'd call me and say, "Hey, Larry, what do you think about this?" And then, so I got a lot of recognition from those, basically going to every office in the company over that year. With him, he called me and he said, "We've got a problem at an alcohol plant that the company had built out in Monte Vista, Colorado." He says it's losing millions of dollars, and we can't get a good answer of what's going on. He said, we would like you to go out there for 6 months and tell us what we have to do to either get rid of it or fix it. And I said, do you know what you're asking? And he said, yeah, you're the only person that we can trust to come back and give us a good answer. And I said, okay, you got my attention. So they called me up to Omaha, and the president of the architecture and engineering side of the business, a guy named Bob Crone. He had been there for a long time, and I sat with him, and he told me what the mission was. And he said, you got a blank slate, go do what you have to do. And so I spent 6 months while I was to go out there. Again, I said, you got to give me time. I can't just do this overnight. This was an operating ethanol plant made from potatoes. And go back, a little backstory to that is I built an alcohol plant when I was in Pensacola with HDR out in Ames, Iowa. No, Hastings, Nebraska. It was a 10 million gallon per year alcohol plant. So I had some background in it. So I went out to Monte Vista, Colorado, spent a lot of time, like weeks at a time out there. And we hired a consultant that was a pro in the alcohol business and the process side. I knew the mechanical side, but not the process. So we went through what had to be done, and he said we would have to spend $1 million, and it could get the alcohol. We could produce the alcohol, but it had a byproduct called distiller dried grains, DDG, that were fed to cattle. So you processed all these potatoes, and then all the leftovers was fed to cattle. And he said, we can meet the alcohol production, but we can't meet the DDG production. But the contract that HDR had signed required us to meet 100% of the output of both. And it was going to take us $1 million to meet the alcohol production, and we could meet about 80% of the DDG. So I went back to a big meeting in Omaha with Bob Crone and others involved, Bob Pine, the CFO. And what should we do? And I said, well, my recommendation is to talk to your attorneys, talk to your bankers, find out what you can do to buy your way out of the problem. Because I said, we can't solve the problem. We can spend $1 million and we can produce the alcohol, but we can't meet the production guarantees. So my advice is to get out of it now. Go to these bankers and attorneys and whatever, we'd already spent $13 million. And I don't think it's wise to spend another $1 million and still not be able to meet the guarantees. So I was invited out of the room, and they, the higher ups, they went through it. They said, we want you to go back, spend the money, do what you can. And so I went back out, and we spent, another 3 months or so buying equipment, spending the $1 million, doing what we had to do to get the alcohol production up to the 1 million gallons a year. I think it was 1 million gallons a year. And we called in their observers, the client's observers that were going to observe the production runs. And we ran for 3 days. We produced at a rate of 1 million gallons a year, but we did what I said. We couldn't meet the DDG, and so we failed the test. So I went back home. By that point, my time was over. Flew back to Minnesota, talked to them, Bob and Bob Pine, Bob Crone, about the results. And they said, okay, we'll let you know what to do next. So my thought at that point was that I was going to be looking for a job because they were going to be spending more money. They spent $1 million more already, and they were going to spend more money to get out of it. So I was worried about my job, truthfully. And I think it was near the end of the year because we ran that production test during the winter. So it's near the end of the year. So I thought I was going to get fired. I got the biggest bonus I ever had in my life. It was like, wow.
You're rewarded for being right. That's a good thing.
Wow. How did that happen? And my boss, who was Dick, he was the head of the engineering side, said, Larry, you did what they asked you to do. They didn't do what you recommended that they do. So that's on them. And they realized it. And so I got a big bonus.
Yeah, so, behind you, we've got the photo of the sailboat. When did you become interested in sailing? And tell us about, once you retired, your sailing trip. What an adventure that was.
Well, I grew up in St. Pete fishing and water skiing. So that was my boating experience with motorboats. When I first came to Pensacola, one of the guys that worked for me in the engineering department was a sailor, and he invited me to go out sailing on a beautiful, fairly calm, moonlit night. And I just fell in love. That was it. I found my passion. So I bought a 23-foot sailboat I had a partner, but he wasn't a financial partner. He was in the Navy, and I knew he was going to be transferred. So I said, let me buy the boat. You take care of the maintenance and the slip fees, and you're going to leave in 2 years. So that way I won't have to worry about buying out your half of the boat. So he and I and our families worked out a deal where he'd have it one weekend and we'd have it the next. It turned out we were on the boat all the time together and became great friends. So he left 2 years later, like we expected, and then I bought a bigger boat, a 30-foot boat, before we transferred to Houston. A year before I went to Minnesota, we bought a 30-foot sailboat and sailed that extensively, a lot of weekend cruising. Then went to Minnesota and we sold it because our sailing season went from a year to 3 months. And it would cost me as much for 3 months to keep a boat as it did the whole year down in Houston or Pensacola. So we sold it. And then in 1981, the year after we moved to Minnesota, we chartered a sailboat with my boss, Bob, in Pensacola. And the salesman that wasn't selling anything, we took a charter into the Virgin Islands for a week and just had a fabulous time. And we said, talking to my wife one nice moonlit night on the deck of the boat outside of the bitter end in British Virgin Gorda, someday we're going to come back and do this on our own boat. And 28 years later, we did. And that was part of our 6-year journey around the Caribbean.
What's the name of the boat?
It was called Loafer's Glory. Loafer's Glory, Roman numeral 2.
That's fantastic. And what was of those 6 years, does anything stand out for you? Good or
everything.
bad?
Everything. Well, the thing that stands out, the sailing was great, but the difference between what we were doing and what you do on a cruise ship is, on a cruise ship you go spend an afternoon at a port.
Right.
We would go spend months at a port. We would get to know some of the locals. We'd have lunch with them. We'd have dinner with them on our boat. We'd go diving with them. So we became part of their culture. And that that was better than the sailing, was meeting all the local people. And uh, probably the best story I can tell about that was we were in the San Blas Islands in Panama, and they're inhabited by the Kuna Indians, Kuna. They're Panamanian. Used to be Colombian. They fought a war and ended up with a truce with the Panamanians. The Panamanians would let them keep their own language and territory, but they had to follow some of the Panamanian rules. Well, when we first got there, a young Kuna Indian, about probably 20 or 25 years old, paddled up in his dugout canoe, and he started talking to us in Spanish. And I had learned enough Spanish that I could get by. I wasn't conversational, but I could get by. So I started talking back with him in Spanish, and he's standing there in his canoe hanging onto the side of the boat. And after we talked for a few minutes, he did like this. He said, "Lapis" means the pencil, right? He said, "La pinza, lapis et papele," pencil and paper. So I went and got a pencil and a paper, and I said, "Come on aboard." So he came aboard the boat, and we kept talking. And he said, "Madre," and I said, "Mother," and he said, "Pop." He said, "Madre, mother, pop." And he had me write those three words down across the paper. And then he, "Padre, father, non-pop." And before he left, we had 2 whole pages filled up with Kuna language, Spanish and English. And he left. He said he was out working. He was out collecting coconuts or whatever that he was doing. And he invited us to come to his village at 2 p.m. La dos in la tarde, 2 p.m. That's 2 in the afternoon. And so we met him at his village at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. His village is an island that is totally filled up with Indian huts. There's no spare room. It's full. He met us at the dock in his best dress, which was not fancy, but for the island, it was best dressed. He took us around and introduced us to his family. They're cooking over an open fire inside their palapa hut. His wife is holding the baby, she's half naked from the top, and the baby's breastfeeding. And he took us to the chief, Saila. I forget the exact name of the Kuna chief, but he took us to meet the mayor or the chief of the island, showed us where they hold their meetings and everything. And that was an unforgettable experience. So, that the people were the best part of the whole 6 years.
That's great. So, Larry, you have had such a great career, you had such a great family, and those kinds of great memories. And this interview will be seen and heard by your 10 grandkids and your great grandchild and the other great grandchildren and grandchildren that you'll have. So, if you could impart your secret of life to your grandkids and your great grandkids, what would you say? What's your secret to life?
I'm going to show it to you. You won't be able to read it.
Okay. A Survivor's Recipe for Life by you. And
Yeah.
You are a cancer survivor.
Yes. This was the company I worked for. This was a cookbook that I came to after I left HDR, Baskerville Donovan. And they wanted to prepare a cookbook. So they asked everybody in the company to prepare a recipe. And so they asked me for a recipe. And I thought about it for a while, and I said, this is the best thing I can do, rather than, I'm not a cook. I stay out of the kitchen. So I wrote this survivor's recipe for life. First thing is always keep a positive attitude. And I can email this to you if you want to. The second one is treat others the way you want to be treated. The third is look for the good in everyone. The fourth is don't be afraid to be a parent to your kids and a friend to your grandkids. The next is make the best out of a bad situation. The next is remember the grass is not greener on the other side. I have to tell you a little story about that. One of the guys that worked for me had a picture in his design cubicle, and it was a picture of 4 cows, and they're each in a different pasture. It's at the corner of a pasture, so their fence was here, the pole, and 4 corners. And the picture showed each cow with his head over in the other cow's pasture, eating the grass. So the cows didn't have their head eating the grass in their own pasture. They were each eating out of another pasture. And I love that picture so much because I always had that philosophy that when I've got 2 of my grandkids married now,
Wow.
I had that photo reproduced and framed, and I gave it to them before they got married with a quote on the back of it that talks about the grass is not greener on the other side, as it applies to marriage, job, a lot of different things. So that's the backstory behind that. The next one is don't wait to tell your father, I love you. I was probably 40 before I was able to do that. Balance work, pleasure, family, eat healthy, exercise regularly, and get regular medical checkups, and develop a strong religious faith. And then mix all the above ingredients together in your daily lives, and you will live a happy, successful life and be respected. So
that's perfect for your grandkids. Okay, you're for your kids, Krista and Greg and Jeremy. I know how proud you are of them, their lives, the fact that they've all graduated from college. But now is your opportunity to tell them what you think of them right now, as you are here with us. How proud you are, and what your thoughts are about Krista, Greg, and Jeremy.
well, I think they're all great in their own way. We love them all. I think we have a very close family. My grandmother fostered that. My parents fostered that. And as we've developed our family, we've fostered that, and we try to get together as a family every year. But every one of my kids has achieved what I think is great in their own way. We've developed them to be independent, or we've raised them to be independent. Sometimes we thought they were too independent. that's the way I was, so I can relate to that. But we just love each and every one of them for who they are and what they are and what they've done in their life, and we couldn't be more proud of it.
And we, as you and your bride of 58 years, Anne Marie. And so as we wrap up here, tell your family, tell Anne Marie how much she means to you and how much she has meant to this family.
She's everything to me. And that's hard right now. I don't know if Krista has shared with you what she's gone through, but she's in a difficult time. But she is everything to me all my life. I love her so much.
I know that you two have had a wonderful life together, and I'm so appreciative of you sharing the stories with us, and, your career, your family, and your joys in life, and the experiences that you've had, Larry. Thank you so much, and we appreciate this, and we hope that your descendants really enjoy this for years to come.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it too.
Thank
I
you.
like sharing.
It's been fantastic. Larry Bowyer,
Okay.
Randy Karraker, hope you enjoyed this on SoundStory.